Hello everybody, my name is Rachel and welcome to another weekly reading wrap-up where I tell you about all the things I finished reading in the past 7 days. And it was a good week for getting things read. I think I have 5 things to talk about today, and I'm going to go from weakest to strongest. And happily there's only one truly weak book to talk about. And yeah, let's start with that. It was The Last Emperor by John Scalzi. This is the final book in the Interdependency trilogy, and because it is the conclusion to the series, I'm not going to talk about the plot at all here for fear of spoilers. So, Scalzi has been very public about the fact that his last couple of books, including The Last Emperor, have been rushed and written and handed in at the very last minute or even past the deadline. And he talks about that again in the acknowledgement section of this particular book. And I've now seen multiple people comment on this, and I'm going to join their ranks. This is the first of Scalzi's last minute novels that I think actually shows it's a rush job. This book needed more time. It needed a couple rounds of developmental edits. The first third, maybe even the first half, is just repeating information that you already know from the first 2 books. And then the second half just kind of throws some answers at you, and I did not have any excitement about it. I didn't think that reading the book was a chore. It still has some of the humor and that breezy, fun style and lots of profanity that you can kind of expect from Scalzi's books and from his characters. But I should have been excited by the answers. I should have been excited by the conclusion to this series, which I think has a really cool premise. And I actually skim read the last couple of pages and was like, okay, that's it, that's over, and wow, that was not as good as it could have been. I mean, most of my thoughts about this book could be summed up as it was as good as it needed to be to make it to print, but not any better than that. Merely adequate is not good enough. I don't think this is an abjectly terrible book. I rated it 3 out of 5 stars. It does answer questions. It does wrap up character storylines. It does kind of preserve the characters' personalities and everything. It's not inconsistent in tone or style or anything. It's just rushed and should have been fleshed out and teased out more in some sections with less repetition of stuff you already knew. So, not great. It could have been better. Next up is Lent by Jo Walton, which is a book I will freely admit I probably didn't understand a lot of it. I probably didn't understand a lot of the main points of the book because much of it is about theology and probably humanism, which are 2 subjects I don't know that much about and I'm not super interested in most of the time. And it's a very odd book to try to describe. For the most part, it's like alternate history, historical fiction with a weird theological demonic fantasy element. The first part of this book is a pretty straightforward recounting of Savonarola's life, and Savonarola was a real person. So it's kind of the historical look at his life from his own eyes, and the only twist is that he can really see demons and he can banish them back to hell. And then he discovers a strange stone and things happen. I wasn't sure of the point or the reason for any of this when I was reading the part that was pretty straight historical fiction. I was a little bit bored, but it was very readable because Jo Walton's style just is very, very readable. And it wasn't until the twist that my ears kind of perked up and I was a little bit more interested in what generally was going on. I thought that this was going to be a slow read because of the subject matter, and it turned out I read most of it in 2 days, and I wanted to keep coming back to it to see what the next series of events would be like. I would recommend this if you are just generally interested in kind of a mashup of theology and Christianity and demons and fantasy and historical fiction. And other than that, it's kind of difficult for me to pinpoint who might like this. I'm not so sure that this is a shoe-in for Jo Walton fans. To me, it feels very different from any of her previous books that I've read. But I would hesitantly say that if you really enjoyed her Thessaly series, this is kind of in the same vein as those. I also finished my reread of the Penric and Desdemona novellas by Lois McMaster Bujold. I reread The Orphans of Raspy, and I think I enjoyed it more this time around, but it's still not my absolute favorite in the series. It's one of those 4 out of 5-star ratings from me. I think that I pinpointed this time what isn't perfect for me, and that is much of the story involves Penric captured by pirates trying to protect 2 young orphaned girls. They're facing being sold into slavery or worse for the girls, or ransomed back to their families. And Penric is very, very able to get out of this situation on his own, but he really wants to rescue the girls. And for a lot of the story, there's this fear and stress hovering over everything that I really feel. There's nothing like an impending sense of horrible things happening to young girl children. That is difficult. It bugged me more this time around, and I realized what was going on. I do really like the ending though. I don't want to describe things too much because this is quite far along in the chronology of the series, and talking about any specifics would tell you how previous stories end up. But a character from the previous couple of novellas reappears in more of an official capacity, let's say, and I don't know, I really like Penric. Oh, well, I love Penric and Des, and they have some really good moments in the story, but also Penric has started to really build up his actual family around him, and they're full of characters and full of good people, and I love it. And then I finally read the very, very newest of the novellas, The Physicians of Vilnoc. And in this one, Penric is called in by General Arisadia to his garrison to investigate a mysterious plague that is striking down a lot of these soldiers. So this is a story about, well, an epidemic, basically a plague, which some people may not want to read in times like this with COVID-19 and everything. I find reading about it a little bit more on the cathartic side of things. I mean, I rewatched Contagion for fun. It's a really good movie. So I wasn't nervous at all about going into this story. I figured I was in safe hands with Bujold where the storytelling was concerned. But the actual subject, the topic of the story here wasn't any problem for me either. And it was very interesting to see how Pen and Des would do their job as an actual physician sorcerer, when that is something that Pen really doesn't like. It's not just that there's a plague and it's scary and they don't know what's going on and his family is threatened as well. It's also he now has to volunteer for a role that he really, really doesn't want to do, and he has some previous trauma from. So overall, a really lovely story. I wish that we had seen more of the secondary characters. We only have a brief look at what Nikes is up to, for example. I would love for some of the secondary characters to have more appearances, but most of the series is about Penric and his demon, and that's okay. And lastly, I listened to the audiobook of Moon of the Crusted Snow by Waubgeshig Rice. I had never heard of this book before, but Rhea recommended it for a buddy read that she and I and Bree did recently, and it was really interesting. This is kind of like a mild-mannered apocalyptic thriller. And I say mild-mannered because it's not extreme and it's pretty quiet. And it really reads more like a series of chapter vignettes rather than a really in-depth novel. It's pretty short. I think it's about 200 pages long. This is set in an Anishinaabe community on a reservation in like the very far north of Canada. And it begins with this kind of slow but comfy description of what life is like for the main family in the story, the ties between all the different friends and families on the reservation. And then the power goes out. And the phone lines are down, and nobody's really alarmed because until the current generation, they didn't even have running water on the reservation. It's normal to lose power, and they just like, oh, they'll fix it, the hydro will come back on eventually. And then nobody comes to bring more food and supplies to the trading station, and they've lost contact with the outside world. Clearly something is going on, and should they expect help to arrive, or should they start planning for the long haul, for the power never coming back on? There are people in the story who are trying to bring back the traditional ways, and other people who have adapted more to modern white people life. And it was really interesting. I had difficulty with the first 30% of the audiobook because the narrator speaks very slowly, and I didn't think it was very exciting in the beginning. I kept thinking this was described to me as a thriller, but it begins in the way that it does because it's setting the stage for what life is like for these people. You have to know that, you have to feel it before things can start going wrong and you can feel how it's wrong. And by the time I got to the halfway point, I was hooked. I wanted to know what was going to happen to everybody, and just, it was good. It doesn't have very deep world building. I will tell you right now that there are not any specific answers for what has happened in the story. It's really just looking at what this very isolated community knows. They are completely cut off from the rest of the world in the middle of a terrible winter. It's realistic that they wouldn't know what's going on, and realistic that the reader doesn't know either. But if you really, really need to know specifics of how the end of the world might happen that might bother you, I enjoyed it the way it is. And I understand that Rice is writing a sequel, I think set like 10 years later, that might give some more answers for what happened and what the world becomes after this point. It was good. I would recommend this one. Not my usual fare, but interesting nevertheless. So yeah, those are all the things that I finished reading this past week, and I am now going to go off and enjoy the rest of my holiday weekend and hopefully get a couple more things read. I am about a third of the way through Land Under England by Joseph O'Neill, which I'm enjoying a lot more than I thought I was going to. It reminds me a lot of Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne, except way less irritating. And I've also started The Difference Engine by William Gibson and Bruce Sterling, which I'm very excited about since many of you told me more about it when I hauled it. So we'll see how far I get in both of these before the long weekend is over. So anyway, I hope you are having a good weekend. Let me know what you are up to and what you are reading. If you have read or want to read any of the books that I talked about today, leave me a comment down below. And I'll be back very soon to talk to you again. And until then, bye.